In villages long forgotten by maps, tucked between dark forests and lifeless hills, winter did not arrive gently. It crept in like a silent predator, biting through the cracks of wooden walls, stealing warmth with every passing hour. The air itself seemed to freeze in place, heavy and unforgiving. There were no heaters buzzing in the background, no cozy blankets fresh from the dryer, no shelves lined with cans and comfort. Life had to be carved out of ice and hardship. People did not simply live through the cold, they endured it, bracing themselves for the long, merciless siege of snow and wind. It was not about waiting for spring, it was about making it to tomorrow. Every sunrise felt like a small miracle. Every fire lit was a flicker of defiance. The wind, sharp as broken glass, slipped through the smallest spaces in the walls, whispering secrets from a world where warmth had long been forgotten. Roofs groaned under the weight of endless snow. Doors froze shut overnight. The sky stayed gray for days, sometimes weeks, and the sun, when it appeared, was nothing more than a pale ghost behind the clouds. Inside their simple homes, families would huddle together, not out of affection, but for survival. The body heat of a child could mean the difference between waking up and not. Silence was everywhere, but it was not peaceful. It was the kind of silence that reminded you how far you were from help, from rescue, from anything but the cold. They learned quickly that winter punished mistakes. Forgetting to stack enough firewood could cost dearly. Losing track of time outside could leave someone stiff and trembling, breath turning to mist, fingers stiffening like stone. The woods were not a sanctuary. They were a trap dressed in white. A simple walk to fetch water could end with a twisted ankle buried beneath snow. Each step was careful, deliberate, as if the earth itself had become a puzzle with deadly consequences. And still, they moved forward, because they had to, because the world did not pause for the unprepared. In the heart of it all was a quiet resilience, raw, unpolished, and without romance. There was no glory in surviving the winter, only grit. No one told tales of how brave they had been. They were too busy chopping wood, repairing roofs, sewing new layers of clothing from whatever scraps they had. Survival was not a triumph. It was a daily ritual of doing what had to be done. And yet, in that slow, frozen suffering, there was something deeply human, something ancient. In the smoke curling from chimney tops and the distant howls in the night, you could feel it. Not the presence of hope, but the refusal to surrender. By the time the last leaves fell and the winds began to howl through the trees, every farmer in the village knew the countdown had begun. Autumn did not simply mark the end of harvest. It was the final warning. Everything not stored in time would rot, freeze, or vanish beneath the snow. And in the medieval world, hunger was not a distant fear. It was a shadow that moved through every barn, every cellar, every kitchen. Preserving food was not a skill. It was survival strategy. Meat was packed with salt until it hardened like leather. Grains were hidden in sealed jars, covered with wax to block out moisture and pests. Root vegetables were buried deep in crates of sand, away from the rot and cold. These methods were rough, often bitter, but they kept people alive. There was no such thing as excess. There were no banquets, no indulgence, only calculation. Each portion of food was weighed not by appetite, but by necessity. Waste was unthinkable. Those who took more than they needed were seen as threats to the community's survival. Bread, when there was flour, was often mixed with sawdust or the powdered bark of trees to stretch what little there was. Hunger changed everything. It taught children silence, discipline, and sacrifice. They learned early that the locked storeroom was sacred ground. They could cry, plead, even dream, but they could not touch it. That food was not for today. It was for the days when the wind would scream louder than their stomachs. The hunger season, as some called it, turned every meal into a kind of ceremony. A single bowl of porridge was treated with reverence. People ate slowly, savoring the warmth, the texture, even the blandness, because they knew the taste of nothing was always waiting. Mothers rationed meals with mathematical precision, turning small piles into hope. Fathers hunted even in the snow, tracking rabbits and deer not for sport but for survival. And when meat was caught, it was not feasted upon. It was dried, salted, smoked, and stored. A bite today was always weighed against tomorrow. Every spoonful, every crumb became a silent promise. One more night, one more dawn. Hunger had no mercy. It did not care about age, strength, or prayers, but it shaped people into creatures of foresight, discipline, and quiet resilience. Villages that survived harsh winters were not lucky. They were meticulous. They counted every potato, monitored every sack, protected their stores like treasure. And sometimes, despite all the preparation, the cold outlasted the food. That was when the true test began. Not of strength, but of spirit. And in those final, thin weeks, when the cellars echoed empty and hope clung by a thread, those who had saved enough were the ones who lit the fires, told the stories, and waited for spring. In the medieval winter, clothing was never about appearance, it was about survival. A coat was not a choice, it was a shield. Fashion did not exist when the air could cut through skin like glass and turn fingers stiff in seconds. People dressed in layers, often as many as they could manage, using coarse wool, stiff leather, and whatever scraps they had left from seasons past. Every piece was hand-stitched, patched, and repaired until it could barely hold together, yet they wore them proudly, not for beauty, but for warmth. The smell of smoke clung to every sleeve, and the dampness of cold stone homes soaked into every fold, but none of it mattered. All that mattered was staying warm enough to wake up the next morning. Feet were the first to suffer. Thick leather boots, often too tight or too loose, were stuffed with dry straw, moss, or even animal hair to block the cold rising from frozen ground. But no matter how much was stuffed inside, the chill found its way through. Hands were wrapped in cloth strips, sometimes soaked in animal fat to trap heat, yet they cracked and bled from the relentless dry air. Wrists turned red, knuckles split open. People wore hats so thick they pressed into the skin, covering ears completely, as even a short exposure could lead to pain that lingered for days. Every inch of skin had to be covered. Not to feel comfortable, but to avoid damage. Inside the homes, there was no real escape. Walls let the cold seep in like breath through a cracked door. Fire helped, but it was never enough. So people turned to what the forests and animals gave them: furs. Heavy pelts draped over shoulders, backs, and beds. Wrapping oneself in the skin of a bear or a deer was not a luxury, it was a necessity. These furs were passed down, valued more than gold, worn until the seams gave way and the edges frayed. Families slept wrapped together under layers of these animal hides, their breaths rising in clouds even indoors. And when they stirred in the early light, ice often framed the inside of the windows, a silent reminder that even four walls could not keep winter out. The cold was clever. It searched for weak spots like a thief in the night: a gap at the collar, a loose seam at the shoulder, a damp spot in a boot. It would creep in unnoticed and settle in the bones. People learned to listen, to their own bodies, to the signs of failing warmth, to the rhythm of the cold outside. Dressing for winter was not a task, it was a ritual. Layer after layer, knot after knot, each wrap and stitch was a statement: I am not done yet. The winter may take the crops, the livestock, and even the light, but it will not take me, not today. Medieval shelters were not built for comfort. They were built to endure. Every plank of wood, every wall of packed mud, every stone stacked in place had one purpose: survival. These were not cozy cottages with warm candlelight and soft beds. These were fortresses against the cold, however fragile. The walls, often patched with dried mud or even animal waste, were crude barriers trying to hold back a force far more powerful than them. The roofs leaked, the floors froze, and yet these rough structures became sanctuaries of hope, not because they offered true protection, but because they offered a place to fight back. Even the grandest castles, with their towering walls and thick stone chambers, were cold enough to turn breath into frost. The illusion of safety often shattered the moment one touched the icy surface of a stone wall at dawn. Inside the homes, people did not sleep apart. They huddled close, pressed shoulder to shoulder under layers of fur and rough-spun wool. Children, parents, elders, everyone clustered together, sharing the warmth of their bodies like animals in a stable. Privacy did not exist in winter. Survival erased the boundaries. Windows, if they could be called that, were covered in oiled cloth, thick fabric, or stitched together animal skins. Glass was rare, expensive, and useless in most villages. Every opening was a threat, every draft a warning. And so the people sealed their homes the best they could, with mud, straw, and anything that kept the wind from slicing through the air inside like a knife. The fireplace stood at the center of it all, not for decoration, but as the true heart of the home. A weak fire meant a long night. A fire that went out meant waking up to a room filled with silence, and sometimes stillness. The kind no one spoke of, but everyone understood. Wood was hoarded like treasure. Ashes were kept to insulate embers overnight. The smell of smoke soaked into every surface, into every piece of clothing, into the skin itself. It was not unpleasant. It was the scent of life clinging on. In the coldest weeks, even livestock would be brought indoors, not as pets, but as living sources of heat. A cow's breath, a goat's body, could mean 1 or 2 degrees more warmth. And in the unforgiving heart of winter, 1 or 2 degrees could change everything. Every inch of the home had purpose. Nothing was wasted. Even the space beneath the bed or behind the door could be lined with straw to trap heat. People used stones heated in the fire to place near their feet at night, hoping the warmth would last until morning. Still, it did not always work. There were mornings when someone would not rise, when the frost clung to their eyelashes a little too long, when the silence in the room shifted from peaceful to ominous. These shelters, as fragile as they were, carried the weight of so many hopes. And even in the darkest nights, when the cold pressed in on all sides, they whispered a simple promise. You are not alone in this fight. Surviving winter in the medieval world was not just a battle of body, it was a test of the mind. The cold could wear down the spirit just as quickly as it wore down the flesh. There were days when the sky itself felt heavy, pressing against rooftops and weighing on the hearts of everyone beneath. Those were the days when hope thinned like the last thread in a worn cloak. The snow did not simply fall. It lingered, settled, smothered. Darkness arrived early, stretching the night into something that felt endless. And in that darkness, the mind became both ally and enemy. Fear whispered louder than the wind. Silence echoed louder than voices. But humans, ever defiant, found ways to push back, not always with tools or fire, but with memory, imagination, and ritual. Around flickering hearths, people gathered not only for warmth, but for stories. Tales passed down for generations became shields against despair. Myths of powerful gods who controlled the snowstorms, of ice beasts that hunted the foolish and spared the brave, of ancient songs said to keep evil spirits away. These were not just entertainment. They were medicine for the soul. Each word spoken was a spark in the dark, a reminder that others had endured before. The elders were revered not just for their age, but for the knowledge they carried. They shared secrets that saved lives. Never fall asleep with an empty belly, keep your feet dry at all costs, and heat stones in the fire to place under the blankets before sleeping. These simple acts became sacred habits. Herbal remedies were another line of defense. Women healers, mothers, guardians of forgotten wisdom, boiled roots, bark, and dried leaves into brews that soothed chests and cleared fevers. They knew the plants that could calm a cough before it became something worse. In quiet corners, they whispered to the fire as they stirred, passing their knowledge to daughters with hands already red from the cold. The men, meanwhile, made war against the wind itself. They packed mud around the doorframes, reinforced the walls with moss and straw, and turned their backs to the storm with determination. Each act of preparation, each adjustment to shield a crack or seal a gap, was more than survival, it was resistance. The rituals of winter became rhythms, a quiet dance between instinct and endurance. Boiling stones for warmth, breathing through cloth to keep the lungs from freezing, lighting candles at the same hour each night to mark the passage of time, it all helped tether the mind to something stable. Without these routines, madness could creep in, time could twist, hope could vanish. And yet, even with all the stories, all the knowledge, all the rituals passed from elder to child, the cold always came too close. It prowled like a wolf just beyond the firelight. Silent, patient, waiting for the moment someone let their guard down. And so the people stayed vigilant, not just with their hands and tools, but with their thoughts, their traditions, and the quiet, stubborn strength that told them, survive, no matter what. In the harsh reality of medieval warfare, winter was a merciless enemy far deadlier than any sword or arrow. Armies marching through blizzards found themselves trapped not by opposing forces, but by the unforgiving cold that seeped into their bones and minds. Soldiers clad in heavy armor became frozen statues, their movements slowed to stumbles and then silence. The very weight of their metal protection turned against them, locking joints and stiffening muscles until exhaustion claimed them like unseen predators. Food supplies, essential for survival and strength, froze solid, becoming useless at the very moment they were needed most. Horses, the lifeblood of medieval armies, often collapsed from fatigue and cold, leaving soldiers stranded, vulnerable, and desperate. Entire legions fell not on the battlefield but to frostbite and starvation, victims of a war waged by the relentless winter itself. Military campaigns ground to a halt, not because of brilliant tactics or overwhelming enemy forces, but because of sheer despair and the insurmountable challenge of surviving the frozen wasteland. Commanders wise enough understood that fighting in the dead of winter was futile. Victory was impossible when the cold drained the spirit and strength of every man. Yet despite this knowledge, sieges dragged on. Ambushes were sprung under the veil of falling snow, and silent assassinations whispered through icy forests. The landscape, coated in pristine white, was a deceiving cloak hiding blood spilled and lives lost. Beneath the quiet beauty of snow-covered hills lay a battlefield of an invisible war, one without clear enemies or battle cries. The enemy was absence itself, the absence of warmth, of hope, of life. Soldiers faced a constant, creeping death that did not demand valor or skill, only endurance against a foe that wore no face and carried no banner. Survival meant fighting not just the enemy across the field, but the slow, insidious erosion of body and will. Every breath was a struggle. Every step through snow, deeper than a man's height, was a victory. The Winter War was a cruel test, where only those with the fiercest resolve could hope to live to see the thaw. At the heart of the bitterest winter, when the cold seemed determined to swallow the world whole, ancient rituals rose like flickering flames against the dark. These ceremonies were more than just gatherings. They were desperate pleas woven from faith, fear, and the weight of generations. The winter solstice celebrations were not mere parties. They were cries sent skyward, asking the heavens for mercy and a promise that the sun would return. Villagers would light massive bonfires, their flames roaring like dragons, casting shadows that danced wildly on the snow. These fires were thought to drive away the chill and ward off the spirits of death lurking in the frozen forests. Voices joined together in haunting songs, drums thundered like the heartbeat of the earth itself, and feet pounded the frozen ground until exhaustion stole their strength. Every movement, every note was a reminder. Life still pulsed beneath the ice. In the shadowed corners of these gatherings, witches and healers stirred simmering pots, crafting potions and brews from roots, herbs, and bark. These medicines were the frontline defense against the coughs, fevers, and chills that often meant death in the cold months. Their knowledge was a guarded secret, passed quietly from one generation to the next, whispered in hushed tones beneath the crackling fire. Meanwhile, children wore wooden charms carved with protective symbols, talismans meant to shield them from the winter's deadly grasp. These tokens, humble in appearance, carried the hopes and prayers of entire families. Winter did not only freeze the body, it chilled the soul. But it was in these moments of darkness, between prayers murmured under breath and the warmth of a shared cup, that people found something stronger than cold. It was an invisible force, a stubborn flicker of resilience and community, something that refused to be extinguished no matter how harsh the frost. They did not believe they could conquer the winter, but they believed they could endure it together. And sometimes that was enough to carry on, step by step, breath by breath, until the thaw came.